In here either know Dee or have heard Dee speak before. And that's what I figured. Pretty much everyone knows Dee. For those of you who don't, you're in for a great treat. Dee Wilson, I've known Dee for years now. Actually, when I was at the AG's office, Dee was a client of mine, and I learned a lot from him, getting the privilege of being his attorney. But Dee is currently with Casey Family Programs. The thing that I think I would say you're going to enjoy the most about Dee, or what I hear from people, what I know I always appreciate about Dee, is if you have any research question for Dee about numbers, data, or whatever he knows at Colt, he'll tell you. But that's only half the deal you get with Dee. You also get that, well, that's an interesting number and it's a great graph, but this is what it's like to sit across from a family and do that. Because Dee is someone who is very well steeped and rooted in the line and the reality and the humanity of the work that we do. And I think that always comes out when Dee speaks. And I always appreciate that because he makes it real, but he has all of the science, if you will, backing him up on it. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dee Wilson. I'll get it started.
Is this mic on? Is it not on?
Oh, actually, they've got you mic'd up for the camera. So, do you want this to make you louder?
I could use the handheld.
You want a handheld?
I can just use the handheld. Okay. Well,
Take a minute or two. Let me make sure it's on.
we're going to put the power point.
Yep. Here, I'm going to make this on for you. There you go. Get your power point.
It's good to be back at one of these. I can't remember the last time I spoke at a Reasonable Efforts. Maybe it was last year sometime, but over the years I've talked at these events a number of times, and they're kind of, I go around the country to talk, and these are kind of unusual kind of events. You don't see them everywhere, and this state's been doing them a long time. So I especially appreciated the opportunity to talk about this particular subject, as though many of you in the room know, this has probably been my main interest in child welfare over the last 20 years, and it's every once in a while it's good to take stock. It's good, you have a perspective, and little by little we add to our ideas and the amount of factual information we have and our understanding of research. And every once in a while it's good to step back and say, well, where are we at this point with this particular subject? And as I'm going to try to explain, this has always been a difficult issue in child welfare, and it continues to be. And so just a little bit before we sort of launch into this about, well, what do I see sort of the challenges as being? I mean, those of you who work with the families on a daily basis, you got a real life sense of this. But so just a little bit of a summary. So maybe 10, 12 years ago, I was talking to a very distinguished scholar in Oregon, and this woman has done tremendous work in child welfare and in neglect for a lot of years. And and I was asking her, she was on the verge of retirement, and I was asking her, well, anything else you would like to do before you retire? Any kind of undone kind of business and so forth? And she looks at me for a second. She knew that I was interested in neglect. And she says, you know what I'd really like to do? She says, I would like to crack the code of chronic neglect. So I thought, well, of course, my first reaction to that was kind of competitive, like, hey, you before me kind of thing. But as I thought about it a little bit more, I really appreciated this woman's insight because she knew enough about the subject to know that there were things that we don't understand about it. So we're going to talk. We know a lot about the subject. We know a lot about the families that we're dealing with. But somehow I'm going to try to communicate the idea here that we still don't have a good understanding with what's going on with the families, in my view. We know a lot about substance abuse and depression, co-occurring disorders, poverty. We know all that stuff. And yet, somehow, there's something missing here that we're not understanding. So, secondly, I think even if we do understand a subject really, really well, the people who are on the line, the people I talk to when I do trainings for child welfare staff, they pretty much are asking for, what do we do about it? They're asking for, quote, solutions, whatever that would mean exactly. And I've just found, and a lot of times, some of these staff are frankly very willing to say, I don't really care whether I understand the families at all. If I can help them, if I know what to do about it, if I can do something that's effective. And I've just found over the years that people really have difficulty in hearing, quote, solutions if they don't fit into their concept of what a solution ought to be. So years ago, I got tired of people saying, after I had done a 6-hour training where I thought I had given plenty of recommendations and suggestions and advice for practical work, people would sometimes say on these written evaluations, well, you didn't tell us what we ought to do. And I got baffled by these responses, and so I started actually writing down lists of things that I had said during the training, or at least I hope that I had said. But I just found over the years that people have certain ideas of what a solution is. And in the new evidence-based world that we're all in now, one idea is that, hey, we want a program. Tell us a program. I mean, if we have a chronically neglecting family, give me the name of a program, and then maybe we'll even get the state to buy it. We'll bring the developers in here. Maybe it's Project Safe Care. Maybe it's something like that. Let's buy a program, and we plug the families into the program, and hopefully we don't see them again. I guess what I'm going to try to communicate today is I don't know of any solutions of that type, and I don't really think, I could be wrong, I don't really think that there are going to be any. We're not going to find solutions that make the families go away. But we are going to find ways of helping them better, and I think that we've actually done a lot of that already in the last 10 years or so. So I'm actually a lot more hopeful about the solution thing than I was when I first started thinking a lot and writing about this subject in the 1990s. And finally, there is a morale issue. And we're going to talk about that with the families that we deal with here. But I also want to talk about it in relation to helpers, because there is a real challenge in terms of the helpers themselves not becoming demoralized by the families. So, you don't have to think very far. Once you get a family that's had 20 or 30 prior referrals, and they have got a multitude of ailments and, dirt poor a lot of the time, everything the agency has available has been tried with them. Hard for the helpers not to feel a little bit sort of, what the heck do we do at this point? And so if the helpers from the first minute feel as helpless as the families feel, then things probably aren't going to work out great. So we really have to think about ways of organizing the help that we're doing in a way that makes it possible to stick with this, because this is a tough challenge. If it wasn't tough, I wouldn't be up here talking about it. Someone would have already made a bunch of money on it, or I would have. And I tell you, I haven't. So one of the first things I want to say is that child welfare systems in this country are not designed to cope with this challenge, not designed to cope with chronic neglect, frankly, not designed to cope with neglect itself. And so think about what we are designed to do. Child welfare systems in this country were designed in the 1960s and the 1970s to deal with very serious cases of physical abuse, and later adapted, and that means kids who present to us at CPS report at intake with serious injuries. That's what this whole system of law and organization and intake and investigations and findings and all of that stuff that we're so familiar with, that's what the system was really designed to do. And of course it was later adapted to do that with sexual abuse, and it does it with neglected kids who report when they're imminent danger, kids who obviously we have to do something today about their safety. The system works reasonably well for them. But for all these other kids, a lot of the chronically neglected kids we're going to talk about, but frankly, a lot of the physically abused kids we talked about, the system isn't set up to deal with that. And over the years, I've become more impressed by the impact of design issues. So we can do the workarounds. You can have extraordinary staff and units who make these extraordinary commitments and investments and do all kind of stuff. And yet we're working with a system that's just from the standpoint of this particular problem is frankly a clunker. And if we had to redesign the system, it wouldn't be this one in order to deal with neglect. So what do we know? We know, for example, if this was 2005, I published an article on neglect in 2005. At that point, about 60% of cases, substantiated victims were in the neglect category. Last year, that was almost 80% of victims were found to be neglected. And in some states, more than 100%. Well, you say, well, how could there be more than 100%? Because in some states, the families were reported and substantiated more than one time. Actually, in New York State last year, it was something like 110% of victims were neglected. Imagine that for a second. Every last child who was substantiated for abuse and neglect in that state was a neglected child. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't also abused. In the NCAN statistics, you can be abused and sexually abused and emotionally abused and educationally neglected. I mean, so you can have multiple types of maltreatment in that particular system. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is even in the course of 7 years, there has been a tremendous increase in the percentage of total victims who are substantiated for neglect, and even in a 7-year period of time. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is so, and a lot of it has to do with the great progress we've made in the prevention and the treatment of physical abuse and sexual abuse. So this is a success story in child welfare. It's amazing that we don't brag about it more than we actually do, but there has been a tremendous change and a tremendous positive change for the better in the last 15 to 20 years, in not only in the official NCAN statistics relative to physical abuse and sexual abuse, but in many other sources as well. In the national incidence studies, as an example. In other longitudinal studies, in surveys of adolescents in the Midwest. There are just a variety of different sources that say when we're talking about sexual abuse and physical abuse, this country has made a lot of progress in recent years. Not seemingly the same amount of progress when we're talking about neglect. Well, these are two of the best scholars in child welfare, in my opinion, and Jane Walfogel is at Harvard. I think she's still there. Isabel Wallach is retired. Both of these scholars have provided strong evidence that high child poverty rates in English-speaking countries lead to child protection systems that are dominated by neglect reports. And so this is really sort of a linear kind of a deal. The higher the country's rate of child poverty, the more likely it is that their child protection system is going to have very high percentages of neglect reports, right? And in kind of a linear kind of way. The more the poverty rate goes up, the more the system gets neglect reports. Well, right off the bat, that says that there's some sort of a relationship there, and the question is, well, what kind of a relationship is it? So when we think about the actual child welfare system we have in this country, it is very much a product of our social economic system. It is very much a product of the kind of income inequality that we have in this country. You know, the Kids Count 2013 report just came out in the last three weeks or so. Last month, if you hadn't seen that, you ought to. You ought to take a look at that. So that comes out every year. And wow, there's some really alarming stuff there. And the most alarming thing is that child poverty rates, even as the recession begins to sort of wane, child poverty rates continue to go up in this country. So 23% nationally now of kids live in poverty. 40 to 50% of kids in this country live in families that make $40,000 to $45,000 a year or less. $40,000 to $45,000 a year or less. So this is a trend that is ominous, not only for the child welfare world, but in all kind of other ways as well. And it is continued to go in the wrong direction here. Well, what do we know in Washington? So POC is Partners for Our Children. Happy to say I was at the University of Washington School of Social Work when Partners for Our Children was formed. And the POC study there in 2009, I think this was published in 2011, but found that about half of families in Washington State with open child welfare cases, this means both kids in care and kids in their own home, had annual incomes of $10,000 or less. And then a subsequent study based on the same sample found that about a fifth of the families had no income at all. No discoverable, findable income whatsoever, nor were they living with anyone who had an income of over $20,000 a year. So when we talk about child welfare in this country, we're really talking not just about families in poverty, we're talking about half of the families being dirt poor. Very, very severely poor. So I want you to think here for a second before I start to weigh in on this a little bit and give you some of my ideas here, because this is very much so. What do we know? You know, I don't need to stand up here in front of a bunch of experienced people in child welfare and tell you that we're talking about chemical dependency and poverty and depression and post-traumatic stress disorder and domestic violence and cognitive impairments. You know all that kind of stuff. The question is really, what's the sort of the connection between these things? If we were talking about achieving a better understanding of the families that we're dealing with, how do we think that this group of factors, what's the causal nexus between them or among them? Concretely, what's causing what here? So I want you to think about here for just a second, and I want to tell you that there is not a right scholarly answer to this at this point. It's not like I'm standing up here with the answer and I'm going to tell you, right? So it isn't like that. I mean, there's still plenty of questions about how do we understand this? Because, of course, we're not just talking about poor families. We're talking about poor, very troubled families who have these chronically relapsing conditions. So think about this for just a second, and anyone have a thought? What's your idea? What is causing what here? There's a sort of a mutual kind of interconnection and relationship. Okay, go ahead.
I didn't want to talk this early in the morning, but the poverty, for me, is the way I see it, poverty leads to essentially you have less assets, less access to resources to deal with the other issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at times that issue, not having those resources, not having the access to services, the stress involved with not being able to provide for your family can be a kind of, I don't know, a situation that could lead to some of the other issues being chronic or relapse or trigger some of the mental health issues or substance abuse. But then if you look at mental health.
You want to take the mic here for a second?
I think we've got a lot of folks on the street that have mental health issues that can't get resolved, who are also poor and not getting the help that they need. So but I think the biggest one is probably the poverty issue that may lead, or the biggest contributor to not having access or causing some of the other stressors and issues that can't get resolved.
Okay, thank you. Any other thoughts here? How this would look?
Thank you. Not sure how to express this, but it seems like people are raised or in a very stressful situation, that I think we tend to lean towards lower brain functioning rather than frontal type functioning, and then that is not always an effective way to go, and it leads to more problems and more stress. And so that's not an explanation, but it's maybe an insight.
Okay. So we're dealing with massive amounts of stress, and it's not helping the overall functioning of people. Okay.
I was just going to say, looking at the 4 blocks, my mind immediately went to working in PCAP, just seeing undiagnosed mental health issues and generations of it. They never even addressed mental health issues, and you've got a couple of generations where it's just kind of passed on, yet unaddressed, which leads into, I say, the poverty, because they're like in a status quo. They don't know anything else. It's all that they've been exposed to, which morphs into the trauma and violence, which coping mechanism would be the substance abuse piece.
Okay. So the thought it just expressed there was that undiagnosed and untreated mental health problems have long-term impacts both on individuals and on their families, and really over generations, really. Anyone else? Go ahead.
I totally agree with Rebecca and also LaShonda. I think it is poverty, but I think it's much more than one generation of poverty. It's generational poverty that leads to all of these issues that do go uncontrolled, untreated for generations. And eventually, I think people get into the mindset that the way their parents, their grandparents dealt with problems is the way to do it. And so they just rely on the same sorts of behavior.
Okay. Okay, let's have one, if there's one more time for one more comment here. Any others?
Well, I would just add that substance abuse and mental health and trauma and violence happen in all, in all stratas or culture, but the people we work with are almost always in poverty. So it's interesting that that all those things happen, but the people that we end up working with are almost always very poor.
Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more. So what we said here is that chemical dependency, mental health problems, violence, all social classes to some extent or other. So, but the families in child welfare, they're usually very, very poor families. A lot of times, as I've already said, very severely poor families here. So just a couple of reflections here before we move on, and just a thought here. So when this country went into recession in 2008, I mean, I think there were many scholars in this country, many people who weren't scholars, and probably many of you who worked in the agencies who began to think, well, wow, something really pretty bad was going to happen in child welfare in the very near future as a result of the recession. And then, interestingly, it didn't. So for the next couple of years, 2-3 years, foster care numbers continue to go down nationally, rates of child abuse and neglect continue to go down, and people start to say, well, hey, we're sort of like Teflon, you know, this is, the recession isn't even kind of affecting us or something, at least in terms of family functioning, right? And then suddenly, about 2011, 2012, studies start to appear showing that now we're starting to see effects, and very, very damaging effects, right? So part of the issues around poverty is that if you've been reasonably well off and your needs have been pretty well cared for, and then you become suddenly poor, you lose your job, it's not like most families and most of us just fall apart instantly. No, a lot of times in the short run, we do better in response to crisis, not worse. Communities do better. They pull together. Families pull together. They share assets. They help one another. You know, they depend on faith communities. They do all kind of things that are adaptive, functional, positive kind of responses, at least for some period of time. And then, of course, as these problems then become chronic and they become long-term, then you start to see little by little the responses that are less positive and less functional. And so I think the pattern in this country in response to recessions has been that the effects are delayed, and they are delayed by anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And so now in 2012, 2013, now in many states we're starting to see very dramatic effects of recession. Not all over the country, not as like what happened in the 1980s when foster care doubled in 10 years. You know, we haven't seen that yet. But also we're starting to see upticks in reports and substantiated victims and so forth 3 to 5 years after recession. Well, imagine that families live in this condition not for 3 to 5 years, but for 10 years. Kids grow up in poverty, or it's intergenerational. That requires some kind of adaptive response. And a lot of times, maybe not the best responses. So anyway, here's my particular version of this, and this isn't, I want to emphasize that this isn't meant to be a total explanation, because I don't think there's going to be anything like that. But if you wanted to sort of say, what would we do if we wanted to go about producing a lot of chronic neglect, what would we do? We'd start off with a high child poverty rate and a high rate of severe long-term poverty. And those aren't, by the way, the same things. So I already mentioned that the national child poverty rate is about 23%, but about 1 out of 10 kids are growing up in long-term severe poverty. And that means that those kids are living in families on the verge of destitution. Add extreme income inequality, which means that what happens to poor people has a material dimension, obviously, but it has a psychological dimension as well. And by the way, extreme income inequality, we already know that this has a tremendous effect on all social classes, not just on the poor. And I mean a direct health effect. So what that concretely means is that rich people in the U.S. do not live as long, on average, as rich people in Western Europe. There is a direct effect on lifespan and on overall health. So add to early onset mood disorders, usually depression, but often in combination with other things. And then here comes substance abuse and family violence on top, right? So particularly when you talk about the chronically neglecting group, of course, we're not just talking about chemically dependent people. We're talking about chemically dependent people with very severe long-term mental health problems, as has already been expressed here. And so in many of the families, of course, obviously then chemical dependency is being used to medicate the mental health problems in the family. So this is why this has sort of a concrete meaning for decision making in juvenile court settings, because if one is making decisions based on families becoming clean and sober, you got to say, hey, whoa, here for a second. Because once families become clean and sober, you might not have better parenting, you might just have a more depressed person here, right? Who still isn't parenting all that well, right? So particularly in the chronic neglect world, co-occurring disorders are the rule, they're not the exception to the rule. And just one more, well, maybe I'll go to the next slide here real quick. Well, what other factors contribute to this? So to say this again, the child welfare system that the U.S. has is a direct product of the social economic system we have. So we have a high rate of poor single parent families. So what does that concretely mean? So WSIP, with the Washington State Institute of Public Policy, you perhaps remember that they published a study on racial disproportionality in 2008 in this state, really one of the best studies ever published in this country on this subject, and it was a descriptive study. So I just am amazed how great a job they did in that study. Well, one of the things that they found in that particular study was that 80% of the kids in foster care came from single parent families. 80%. And at first when I heard that, I didn't believe it, and I got in touch with Marna Miller, and I said, are you sure? You sure you guys didn't make some mistake here? And something like that, but hey, no. Racial biases, of which we'll talk more about here, and ambivalent, confused social attitudes regarding neglect. So I think I'd mentioned before that there has been a very steady, long-term decline in physical abuse and sexual abuse. And part of the reason for that decline, in my view, is that this country has just decided that we're just not going to put up with it. We're just not going to put up with severe physical abuse or sexual abuse of kids. And that means no matter who you are. So if you're a Catholic priest, that doesn't exempt you from this social taboo. If you're a football coach or a lawyer or something, no, there's going to be a consequence for that kind of behavior. We have not made the same, collectively we as a society and communities haven't made that same kind of commitment in terms of neglect. And so there's still a very deep uncertainty about what really ought the responses to these cases be. So I know we have a bunch of different people from different offices here. So, I've done this so let's just ask the same question. I've asked this of 100 groups in Washington over the last several years. So think about, in your office, what's the most reports of neglect that you ever, that is, think of the families and the multiple reports and so forth. What's the most reports that you remember in any case in your office? How many? So that being said, a case from Seattle had 55. I was in a group of Seattle people a few years ago where someone said they had a case with triple-digit referrals in Seattle, over 100 referrals. I've been in groups all over the state, and I've never heard an answer to this that's less than 30. Sometimes it's 40, it's 50, it's 60. And of course, obviously, those are outlier cases. Those are extreme cases. Those aren't necessarily reflective of everything that goes on in the state system. But nevertheless, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, what does it say about the tolerance for that kind of abuse and neglect? What does it really say that we're willing, and I don't just mean people in the agency, I mean courts, and I mean mandated reporters and policymakers and so forth. What does it really say that we can actually have cases that have 40, 50, 60 referrals and kids are still there and they're living in the same conditions and so forth? So it says we don't quite know what to do about it. We don't quite know what to do about it. And of course, one of the answers, the reasons that I think that we have tolerated chronic neglect to the extent that we have, is the inability to answer the question, well, what would it mean if we were less tolerant? Would we really want to double our foster care system? Well, the truth is, in this state, we wouldn't have the capacity to do that even if we were willing to do it, and I think most of us would not be willing to do it. because we've been limited to 5,000 to 6,000 foster families in Washington State for as long as I can remember. There's nothing to suggest that that number is going to increase radically or dramatically, right? So there are some real serious practical problems to saying, well, we're just going to say, hey, stop. So chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment are an extreme form of family breakdown. So if you went to other societies that are less affluent than our own, and many of you probably remember the movie Slumdog Millionaire. Remember that movie from a few years ago that won an Academy Award and so forth, right? And no, you can go to countries in this world where school-age kids are living on the street, and authorities are allowing them to, too. So it seemed like to me that 15, 20 years ago, when it became more common that we had, U.S. actually had lots of adolescents living on the street, and somehow that was acceptable, and we were going to put up with that, and so forth, that ought right away have been an alarm sign. But the fact that you can have countries in the world where they just aren't able to cope. So at the extreme end of family breakdown, you find kids literally who don't have families. Or you find kids who are living in orphanages, very, very large ones, right? That's the sort of at the extreme limit of family breakdown. But there are less extreme parts of that. So, of course, one of the effects of anyone who has ever grown up in a family, my guess, if I poll the room here, about how many of you would say that chemical dependency and mental health problems and or violence have been an issue in your families and your extended families, that'd be a pretty high percentage of this group probably. And I would say that my family is intimately familiar with all of that stuff, right? So what is the effect of those problems on extended family relationships over some period of time, right? And one of those effects is to drive people apart. Because at some point in time, you don't want to put up with addicts. You get tired of it. And so there's a point at which a lot of the families that we're dealing with, they have burned out their extended family groups, right? And so it's not just that the neighbors are sick and tired of them or don't want anything to do with them, it's that their own families don't want anything to do with them. So why have family meeting formats in child welfare, it seems like to me, been such a powerful force and kind of a reform move, both in this state and in other states in recent years, right? Because part of it is if we can begin to reconstitute the family connections, the positive family connections of the families that we're dealing with, these families begin to function better. But those family connections have been put under very, very severe strain by these sort of chronic, ongoing mental health and substance abuse kind of problems, not to mention violence here. Well, so here's one of the maybe positive sunny messages here so far to date. A lot of neglect that we're dealing with is not chronic. And so I think that this is a useful, kind of a very practical and usable kind of a classification scheme for people who work in the child welfare system. And so arguably, just to simplify things without getting into the numbers here in the scholarship, I think it's reasonable to think about sort of this in terms of a third, a third, a third. A lot of the families that come to our attention are coming for situational neglect. We've had 1 or 2 reports at most. There is not ongoing chemical dependency, violence, and mental health problems, and they are not going to come back to our attention. So I guess the thought that I would have is that agencies need one kind of response for those families, and there are a lot of them, fortunately, and another kind of response when we move into these other forms of maltreatment. So sporadic neglect, so there are many folks who have not all the time, not day in, day out chemical dependency or issues or violence issues or depression, but they have episodic, periodic struggles and with these issues and challenges. And at that point, the quality of parenting begins to collapse or decline, and there are reports to the CPS system, and we get involved with the families, right? Those families, it seems like to me, that's where, wow, all the strengths-based rhetoric in child welfare, that's where it's most applicable to me, right? Because these families, to me, even though the problems at the time of report can be very severe and very serious, they're really, the prognosis for those families is very hopeful. Why? Because a lot of the time they are already doing it. They're functioning very, very well. So there's a very hopeful kind of a, so what are we doing in child welfare? We're trying to get them connected with services that are going to help them to get back to their formal, and what is for them really a pretty average level of functioning. So if they're very, very depressed, we want them to get depression treatment. We want them to do something to be able to function on a more regular kind of a basis. And then we move into the sort of the less hopeful kind of thing. So the chronic neglect kind of cases. And the thing, so not just 20, 30, 40 reports. The thing that characterizes these families more than any other single thing is that the neglect is so pervasive. It's not just that there's a lot of reports. It's that if you think about all the different forms of neglect, and you can think about the basic needs of kids, food, shelter, hygiene, medical care, supervision, protection from danger, nurturance, whatever it is, think of a basic need there, and at some point the family is likely to be reported for not fulfilling that need, right? So the neglect touches all child care domains. Now, every once in a while, you're going to find a family that is reported to you multiple times for whom that's just not true. That is, they've been reported 4 or 5 times, but it's always for supervision, or it's always for something related to the education system, or for medical care, or something like that. As amazing as it sounds, that is a hopeful sign that the neglect is not pervasive. It is very specific. And once we have very well-defined problems, much, much easier to solve them. Much, much easier to resolve them than we're talking about having to deal with everything within a family from the time kids get up in the morning until they go to bed at night and everything in between. Right, that's the kind of thing that starts to demoralize helpers, as I mentioned before, that there's too much of this. Where do we even start? I have had workers a lot of times ask me, where do we even start here? And then chronic maltreatment. And so chronic maltreatment, kids are being neglected, but they're also being abused or sexually abused as well. And so actually, a couple of studies recently in Oregon have found that the majority of kids in foster care that have been put there by courts have been abused and neglected in more than one way. They haven't just been neglected. They've also been physically abused, or they've been sexually abused. They've almost always been emotionally abused and neglected. So when we talk about a lot of the kids that we're dealing with here, we're talking about multiple. And so, of course, obviously, that's a more severe, worse kind of condition, and it's a lot tougher to deal with. So one of the things that this classification system does then is begin to suggest sort of maybe a dynamic. And I put this out there as a sort of a hypothesis, as a sort of, I think, a reasonable kind of idea. Speculation is that the families who were in the chronic neglect, chronic maltreatment group, they didn't start off there. I mean, they started off at some other more positive kind of place. And so the question is, there's a certain percentage of those families then who little by little, their maltreatment problems are getting worse. And they are gradually evolving into the chronic neglect, chronic maltreatment kind of a category. So assuming that something like that is true, then of course it says from the standpoint of child welfare systems that the earlier we intervene with families, the better. You know, so if you want to do something that's really reasonable with families and make a good use of your resources, it wouldn't be that we would wait until kids are in a high-risk group. No. We would be investing a lot of our resources in the low-risk groups. Right? Why would we want to do that, right? Because we don't want this dynamic, this process to continue. We don't want sporadically neglectful parents to be chronically neglectful parents. We want to do something to stop the process there. So this might be in your packet, but and the reason I put this up, I realize that this has hard to read, hard to understand what this slide kind of is, particularly if you're sitting in the audience. But the reason I put it up there is just to demonstrate one thing. So this is a study from Missouri of 33,000 families referred to their child welfare system. And what it does is it shows you down the left-hand side the initial allegation that led them to be reported. And so if you look at number 10 there, I think number 10 says something like lack of supervision, something like that. So you had something like 6,000 families in this study who were initially reported for lack of supervision. If you read across there, then you will find that 800 and something of those families were subsequently reported for sexual abuse. 1,100 of the families were reported for physical abuse. All manner of other kind of things. So the point of this slide is that when you deal with a chronic neglect and chronic maltreatment group, whatever the allegation is in a specific report doesn't much matter. It's not an indicator of what's likely to happen in future reports, right? But the assessment problem for agencies is to figure out the whole situation. So you might compare what's in any single report to kind of the tip of the iceberg, or a metaphor that I like that Anthony Lohman, one of the best researchers in this country in neglect, offers, is that any single report is like the single frame of a film. That is, you know, you see previews. Sometimes you go to movies and you see previews of coming attractions and so forth. And so the previews may be really indicative of what the whole movie is like or about and the quality of it, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's just to get you to come back to the movie, right? Not really reflective of the whole deal. But the assessment problem and challenge for public agencies is to figure out the whole picture, not just what's in this single report. So I mentioned before issues around design. So one of the things, for example, that our current child welfare system is designed to do is to get child welfare people from the intake point on to focus on specific allegations. That is, what is an allegation of abuse and neglect that actually warrants a screen-in? And for someone to go out there and see a family and to do something about it, right? So we're thinking about very specific events and conditions, things that happened, right? The more you get into the chronic neglect group, the less that sort of approach seems to make sense. So one of the simplest lessons that I try to get across to practitioners is, at some point you have to abandon the focus on incidents and start to think about patterns. You don't have to do that for situational neglect, because there a focus on incidents is fine, and even for sporadic neglect it makes a certain amount of sense. But once you get into the chronic neglect, chronic maltreatment kind of group, then you need to begin to think about patterns. As opposed to, did this happen yesterday? Was that true? Am I going to found this, that Johnny was left alone after school for 2 hours? Not really what we're trying to figure out in the chronic neglect kind of families. So a little bit of a deeper idea. So what else besides substance abuse, mental health? What's really going on in the families? And I mentioned that there's a sort of a dynamic that's going on there. So these are the two dynamics that I have, come to understand over a period of years. And one of those dynamics is that gradually, under the pressure of substance abuse and mental health and violence, their social norms around parenting are eroding or collapsing. And so to give you a concrete example, some of you may remember a few years ago in Kent, I think, or at least I think it was on the west side, there was a mentally ill mom, if you remember this, who was leaving her 20-month-old in a crib, and for several days at a time, and then she was going off to be with her boyfriend, and then every 4th or 5th day she would come back to the apartment and put some food into the crib for the toddler, the 20-month-old, and she would clean up the crib to a certain extent or other, and then she would leave for 3 or 4 or 5 more days. And as amazing as it sounds, that particular child did not die, right? But you might ask yourself, well, how could anything that extreme, that bizarre, that totally egregious kind of thing, how could that ever occur? How could anything like that even ever occur, right? And I guess what I'm saying is, she didn't go from being a parent who was living with her child and doing a pretty decent job of taking care of his basic needs on a daily basis to being a parent who left for 4 or 5 days at a time and then returned, right? There was a gradual collapse or eroding of parenting behavior, but it's not all at one time. I guess that's the underlying idea. And finally, the loss of self-efficacy associated with depression and demoralization. So self-efficacy here means just something simple like the ability to do things for yourself, the energy it takes just to live. Just to think about the things that it takes on a daily basis for all of you to be sitting in this room here, or for me to be up here talking. What does it take? We have to do a lot of things here in order to get our act together and to be socially acceptable in a minimal kind of a way. Just in order to manage here, right? Well, what if people just because of lack of energy or other mental health problem, what if they're just not able to do that? What if they're just not able to do that? And so we're dealing with a lot of families who they are just not able to do that. And so as we begin to try to understand what's going on with them, we need to try to think a little bit, it seems like to me, in a naturalistic kind of a way. So once you go into some of the homes that we're dealing with, And my guess is any person who's been in child welfare for longer than 2 years in this room, has been in homes that are hard to describe. And so the idea that we would call some group of cases dirty house cases, hey, that doesn't begin to get at it. I mean, most of us have been in homes where it was hard to stay there for 5 minutes. So I have sort of an allergy to cats, even though I have a cat. I was in homes as a caseworker where I had to get up in 2 or 3 minutes and say, hey, I gotta leave. Literally couldn't see. So you wonder, how could it have got to that point in some of the homes that we're dealing with? How could that have happened? And so it has something to this. There's some kind of process or dynamic that's reducing the person's, not only their energy to do these kind of things, but their belief that it would make any difference if they did, or that it would be valuable to do that. And again, to say this one more time, the normal response to this initially is once we see how, wow, over the top some of this behavior is, or some of the home conditions are, the next response a lot of times is to begin to build a little bit of a moralistic response. I mean, I know a lot of poor people, but they don't live like this. I know a lot of poor people, but this is not the way they treat their kids. This is not the way they parent, right? So the first reaction a lot of times is to start to say, hey, there's something wrong with you. And indeed there is. But to do some sort of moral kind of judgment thing initially, understandable, but it's not helpful. So at first, I guess what I want to urge all the practitioners in the room again is to try to cultivate in yourself a little bit of a naturalistic, dispassionate kind of perspective on what you're encountering. I mean, there will be plenty of time for moral judgment. But for a second, think like a scientist would think. Think like a scholar would think. Stand back and say, how did it get to this point? What concretely happened to these people? In terms of a history. And of course, what you're going to find out a lot of the time, maybe not all the time, but a large amount of the time, you're going to find out they have trauma histories. You're going to find out that there's been horrible suffering, terrible things have happened in the families a lot of the time, or to whole entire communities. So what do we know that's important about depression? And it seems like to me on the severe depression that we're dealing with a lot of the families, the important thing to understand is that it has a cognitive element. And that cognitive element, it goes something like this. Whatever it is that I'm depressed about, it ain't going to get any better. If I'm poor, I'm going to remain poor. If I'm unhealthy, I'm not going to recover. If I have a bad marriage, it's done. There's an underlying sort of attitude that whatever it is that ails me, there's nothing that I can do to make it better. So there's an underlying. So you wonder why so many of the families that we deal with seemingly have reasons why they cannot accept our help. Why can't you get to a food bank? Why can't you get to the doctor? Why can't you get your child to a dentist? Why can't you do those things? And always with some sort of X, Y, and Z kind of glass half empty, glass half full kind of response there, right? So because there's an underlying cognitive belief that whatever those resources are that help other people, for some reason or another, they're not going to help me. And again, like other social attitudes, depression, demoralization, hopelessness, that's a very contagious thing. So when I say, we have to organize the helpers in a way that you're somewhat protected against this contagion, because it is a contagion. So your hope and hopefulness and optimism and belief that you can do something positive here has got to be more powerful than the family's belief that you can't do it, right? If they can defeat you right out of the block, well, that's sort of a self-fulfilling kind of a deal there. So indicators of demoralization, and so poor self-care, what's the meaning of the dirty houses kind of thing? The filthy houses. No one's taken out the garbage in a few months. No one has bothered to clean up the animal feces of 10 dogs and cats around the home. And you think, well, wow, these are kind of extreme stories and said for shock value and so forth. Hey, I'm just not even telling you the half of it. I've actually consulted on cases where kids weren't toilet trained in their school age years. They were still wearing diapers. They were using their bedrooms for bathrooms, and that was going on over a period of months or years. No, these are actually things that have actually happened here. So, apathy in the face of threat. I do want to say something about that because I think that is the key primary diagnostic indicator of demoralization. And so, I guess the underlying idea would be that for most of us in this group, if something threatening happened in relation to ourselves or to our children or to our intimate family members, we would have a response. Might not be the wisest response, might not be hugely effective, but we wouldn't be paralyzed, we wouldn't be immobilized, at least in the initial phases of that. We would do something. But what if you're actually in a group that has been convinced over some period of time that any and all responses are completely useless? That in fact your survival may actually depend on your ability to be immobilized. And it seems like to me that that's the underlying kind of condition that we're trying to understand here when we deal with a lot of the families that we're dealing with. So when you ask about what would count as recovery, really, not just chemical dependency recovery, but recovery from this sort of maltreatment sort of pattern and so forth in a lot of the families that we're dealing with, it's something really, really simple. We want the families to get mobilized. We want them to do things on their own behalf. We want them to take an interest in themselves and their kids and do positive things for themselves and their kids on some kind of a consistent basis. That's what it means to be successful in treatment. It's not the same thing as saying someone's been clean and sober for 90 days. As positive as that is, that would be a positive sign. But what we really want to know is, does clean and sober translate into actions? Actions on their own behalf. And a lot of the folks, of course, are going to need a lot of help in getting started. So what's some of the sort of common sense kind of rules that you use with people who are immobilized and who are depressed, severely depressed, and have these negative beliefs and so forth? You know, the underlying kind of treatment rule is baby steps before big steps. Little things before big things. You kind of want to get the people, want to give people some brief experience of success in achieving something, some little something. And then you move forward with that. And so this is my totally unscientific, non-researchy list of things that help me. You know, if I'm really feeling depressed and someone gives me a bunch of money, I just feel better. You know, so hey, if I won the lotto tomorrow, I wouldn't have a morale problem. You know, so maybe that's naive, but for some period of time, no. And I think with lots of folks here, when you think about, just think for yourself, what is it that gets you through the day here? And a lot of times it's little things that we look forward to, not big things. Little things. We look forward to seeing a friend. We look forward to going and having a latte at Starbucks. You know, I think actually if this country ever gets to Mars, you know, Starbucks will be right behind there, you know. So taking pleasure in small things, I do want to mention that because, of course, one of the effects of depression, severe depression, is you begin to lose your capacity for pleasure. And I think of all the things that do people in on a regular kind of basis, do them in emotionally, this one right here has a tremendous impact. If people suddenly are not able to enjoy things, the things that they enjoyed before. I used to like food, but now I don't. I used to be sex obsessed, but now I don't give a damn about sex. I used to like to read, but now, hey, I don't even watch TV. You know, if that's the situation, little by little, that kind of does you in, really, and fairly quickly. So one of the things you want to know about people, if you work in a treatment capacity here, is no matter how bad off they are, you talk about what kind of strength do you want to tap here, start going for what do they still like to do? What still gives them pleasure and enjoyment, right? So you talk about what does building on strengths mean? Let's just start right there. What do you still like to do? No matter whether you think that's the good thing they like or a bad thing, or what is it, right? And sometimes there are funny answers to this question. Now, I've had caseworkers over the years tell me, I had a caseworker once in Tacoma tell me that he had an intuition that the young woman he was dealing with just felt kind of totally worthless, and he got her hooked up in doing volunteer activity at a food bank, and suddenly her mental attitude just totally brightened. She was suddenly, wow, she couldn't do anything else, but she could make it to the food bank. And so sometimes the answers are very concrete and they're kind of like things that might work for us. And other times it's surprising, right? So this is the practice challenge that I mentioned before, right? What does it take to engage hopeless, helpless parents in services or therapeutic activities, right? And if we had more time, and I see that we're not probably going to run out of time here before I finish here, but for the practitioners, I think it's really worthwhile to think about for a second, how do I go about this? What do I actually do? So one of the things that I found years ago with dealing with, because a lot of chronically neglecting parents are pretty nonverbal. I don't mean that they can't talk. I mean they just don't talk very much. They're not too responsive in conversation. They're not too fun to be with. And that's why I think most of us who have depressed friends from time to time, we tend to find that we're avoiding them. They're not too fun. You know, we can't engage them in discussion. They're not really interested in us. We can tell that right off the bat, right? So what do you do with people who are really not, you can't really approach them through conversation? What do? You know, so, and I just found years and years ago that finding some reason to go back on a frequent basis and staying for a few minutes was better than sitting there for 45 minutes or an hour trying to think of something to say. You know, so I wasn't the best conversationalist in the first place, but that was really painful. But I found that just going back on a regular basis, that to some people that really did matter. And then every once in a while I would take donuts, and why? I like donuts. If they don't like it, I'll eat them. So no. What are we going to do? What are we going to do to kind of engage people little by little? And of course it becomes, when you start to think about, well, who really can be helped here? It's like watching for a little spark. You're trying to make a campfire, right? And you're watching for a little spark here, and the little spark is, can I form a connection with this person? Can I form some kind of a relationship with this person so that they actually enjoy seeing me coming? That's a positive thing as opposed to I'm checking up on them or something of that sort here. I do want to recommend a movie, which I'm not going to talk about much here, but just because I think it's good as a training thing. So the American movie is called The Lookout, and it came out about 2007, something like that. And so it's about a young man who suffers traumatic brain injury, and then a criminal gang approaches him because they want him to help out with a bank robbery. And anyway, I recommend the movie because it's 20 minutes of that movie is better than 10 weeks of a social work class in how do you engage people. Because, wow, you see people in this movie who are good at it, right? Okay, so to what extent are the kids in chronically neglecting families in danger? So if they're little kids, if they're 0 to 5, and periodically the truth is that they are likely to be in danger, right? We may not always get reports as a result, but the likelihood is from time to time, but not all the time, the kids are going to be in danger. And they're going to be in danger usually from accidents, right? Now I have just found, looking at the literature on child death surveillance in the last several years since I've been at Casey, that states just have all kind of ways of arriving at what is a neglect-related death. So that's one of those technical issues that the scholarly field has not solved. And maybe if any of you follow child death statistics in Washington State, you probably know that the statistics that the Children's Administration has put out and the statistics that the Ombudsman's Office put out, in some years have varied by as much as 50% in terms of number of deaths here, right? Well, why? It's not because CA's hiding things or anything like that. That's not it. It's they're using different criteria for deciding on what's a neglect-related death, right? So, but yeah, so to a certain extent, kids are in physical danger. And the older they get, the less that's likely to be true, right? Nevertheless, the main harms to children resulting from neglect and chronic neglect are emotional and developmental. And probably, the truth is, this is probably true for physical abuse as well, but there's not any question about in the neglect realm here. Just to think about this just a little bit, give you an idea. probably this state over the last several years has averaged 20 to 25 maltreatment deaths a year on open or recently open cases. That would be a pretty standard kind of a number. Probably half of those, maybe 2/3 of them, have had a neglect component to them. Either neglect as a standalone form of maltreatment or neglect in combination with physical abuse, right? And there's a whole bunch of kids who suffer accidents. That might be 10 times the number there. That might be, if you added all those numbers up, that might be 100 in a year out of maybe 40 to 50,000 kids referred to the CPS system, something like that. But when you talk about kids who are being harmed developmentally and emotionally, you're talking about hundreds and thousands a year. Hundreds and thousands, and what we know, of course, from ACEs studies is that those are very long-term consequences. Those are lifelong things. They're not like a bruise heals. Well, let's see. Can we try this video? So we're going to pause for just a second and see if we can look at this video here.
A newborn is bombarded with sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches. One of the infant's first jobs is to develop a way of handling all these new experiences. Professor Edward Tronick of the University of Massachusetts began his work in the early 1970s. The emphasis in child psychology then was on how children learn. But his early studies suggested a dramatic new direction.
When I first started working on this, I was working at an infant daycare center, and I felt like, gee, you know, I'm a real hotshot at this, so I'm going to do this kind of curriculum for these kids, and these kids are going to be really smart. And then as soon as I got there, I saw 6 or 7 infants out there being played with by different caretakers. And each of the teachers had to find a different rhythm, if you will, in themselves to fit to the different babies.
Tronick believes that emotions come first. If the baby fusses all the time, it can't begin to learn about the world. It's the emotional dialogue between parent and child which enables the infant to begin to control its emotions, and at the same time lets the parents know how much stimulation the baby can handle.
What she's doing is she comes in really close, and so there's all this stimulation now coming from the outside. Now, in a way that gets his attention, but at the same time, again, he has to be able to deal with that. So what he starts to do, he decreases the stimulation, he looks away, helps to get himself back under control, and then he can come back and now re-engage with the mother. She does that hand movement, she smiles, he says, oh, I need a little break again. So he disengages. And then he smiles and she comes back in, so that they're really in sync with one another. But if they do get out of sync, he knows that if he then smiles, that she'll come back. And what you're seeing is almost a perfect dance between them.
After studying hundreds of infants and mothers, Tronick became convinced that this dance between parent and child is characteristic of most normal interactions. He believes this wordless dialogue initiates a bond of mutual expectation and trust. But what happens if that bond of expectations is interrupted?
The procedure that we thought about was to ask the mothers to not respond to what the infants were doing. He looks at her, he smiles, big, full smile. Realizes right there that she's not doing what he expected. So what he does now is something we saw him doing in the normal interaction. He looks away, he disengages. He's saying, something's wrong, I'm getting a little upset. This isn't exactly right. So I'll look over here. Right now he's saying, this doesn't feel real good. And I'm going to try again. And looking at my hands is a way, I'll calm down a little. It's a kind of self-comforting. It comes back here, looks at her, but there's no smile. There you see him drool. And this is a baby who wasn't drooling before. Didn't have any of the signs of even losing a little bodily control. He starts tonguing, another sign of being upset, and now he's hiccuping. And his whole body, if you will, is getting, to some extent, unregulated.
If this response occurs in the laboratory, what happens when infants are emotionally deprived over long periods of time? Tronick discovered similar kinds of behavior in the babies of chronically depressed mothers.
The infants of depressed mothers have been experiencing this kind of interaction on a regular basis and develop a pattern of being disengaged from their mothers.
Tronick's findings about the role of strong emotional ties in the life of the baby echo the research of psychiatrist Renee Spitz in the 1940s. Capturing a much more extreme situation, Spitz filmed infants who were institutionalized when their mothers were jailed. Many of the children he studied became apathetic, cried continuously, and lost weight. Their natural resistance was lowered, and some died. Dr. Robert Emdy, an infant researcher at the University of Colorado Medical School, was a student of Spitz.
Renee Spitz really shocked the world with very painful, dramatic pictures of children who looked so painfully sad and devastated. And although their physical needs were being attended to, they lacked the emotional availability of caregivers. These infants looked horrifically sad, in a strict analogy to grief in an older child or adult. Infants also can be grieved. And people couldn't bear to look at those films. It's very hard to look at them today. Some of the extreme situations may look very unusual and abnormal, and you might say, well, that doesn't exist today. Unfortunately, these awful, pained, emotionally starved expressions are seen today. There is an epidemic of child abuse and neglect, and it's a very serious problem. And in fact, when we see this expression, we teach clinicians to explore further, because intervention and help needs to be on the way.
These films presented persuasive evidence that a strong tie with a caring adult is crucial to the infant's emotional and physical well-being. They had an extraordinary impact on the study of infant emotions and the treatment of emotional disorders.
So anyway, a lot of research there on kids who were little kids being raised in institutional kind of settings, foundling homes. You know, I was at a Reasonable Efforts conference a year or two ago when people in the audience started to make fun of me because I was saying fondling homes, you know, which is, I didn't realize I was, but so they asked me to spell it for them. So I don't know. I hope I spelled it correctly. But the whole point being there that a lot of kids raised in those kind of situations where they were receiving very good physical care from nurses a lot of times and other folks, but did not have a caregiver. A lot of those kids died. A lot of those kids being raised in foundling homes died, and they would spend months there. So in one Spitz's studies in Denver, anywhere from 1/3 to 2/3 of the kids who had spent a year or more in that particular kind of institutional setting died. So one of the things he did at one point is he compared those kids with kids who were being raised in another kind of institutional settings where mothers were jailed, but nevertheless were being allowed to parent their babies for a certain amount of time each day, and compared the deaths in one situation to the deaths in the other. Well, 0 deaths with the kids who had the mothering, and 36 out of 90 kids died if they didn't have a mother. Wow, you know, some pretty powerful findings there. So one of the sort of messages here, though, for us, who we don't live in a society, fortunately, that has these kind of homes anymore, but what's the take-home message about neglect here? Which it is this: at its very extreme kind of limits, neglect compromises the immune systems of kids. So even more than kids dying in accidents or something like that, you know, in a neglectful kind of home. You're talking about kids who are likely to be in very poor health. So a year or two ago, I consulted with a southern state that had a whole rash of child deaths with kids 0 to 1, where kids had just died of all kind of and sundry illnesses. Right? And so I asked them, well, living in neglecting families? So, and the answer was pretty much yes to that. So that's just a risk that somehow as a child welfare system, we haven't quite figured out what to do about it, right? Because of course, obviously, some of those kids could have been ill or died from all kind of, so to speak, natural causes. But the risk of illness and the risk of death from illness, that's a real issue in very, very severe neglect, right? Now, for the most part, however, back to the blank face video here for just a second. What's the sort of the idea that this video is trying to get across? Which is that kids, babies, need regulators. They need parents, attachment figures, who are going to help them to regulate even their physiology. So the idea here is that the drooling, of course, is a sign, an early, sort of a small sign of physiological dysregulation. Same ditto with the hiccuping. And that if this were to go on, this sort of response or lack of responsiveness to the baby over some period of time, then the likelihood that this baby would begin to have more important signs of dysregulation. And those would probably have to do with sleeping and eating. That would probably, so then the underlying idea then is that physiological dysregulation leads to emotional dysregulation. So a lot of the kids that we're dealing with, you know, so kids who are severely neglected, whether or not you call neglect trauma or not, and there's a group of scholars who think it's wrong to do that, whether that's right or wrong, the kids pretty much have the same symptoms. So what's the main issue with traumatized kids? Affective dysregulation. Trauma is an issue that has to do with malfunctions of a regulatory system. Well, why? Because, of course, babies need a co-regulator. They don't learn to self-regulate on their own. They have to have the cooperation and help of someone. And that someone is usually the attachment figure. So I guess what I'm saying is sort of when we talk about chronic neglect, then we need to get a developmental focus here. So how does our orientation need to change compared to situational neglect? We need to think developmentally. We need to start thinking about, well, what's been the effect on the kids to date, right? And so here we actually need, this is my opinion, we need to bring child development experts into child welfare systems literally as employees. If I had my way, I'd bring a cadre of public health nurses into public agencies because they're trained in child development. That's the kind of information and knowledge we need. Lacking that, we need to go partner with those people in the community. We need their help. We need the help of pediatricians. We need the help of people who understand brain science and infant mental health. That's what we need. So the idea here is that if we're sort of evaluating what harm has been done, we need to go back to the question of, well, what emotional and development harm has been done and what can be done to restore the kids, right? So of course, when we talk about, well, then what do we want parents to be able to do? Just as we, you know, this is a mom who's pretending this blank face thing. Well, obviously, she can be responsive. She could turn it on like a light switch, on and off kind of thing. But a lot of the parents that we're dealing with, they don't have that ability. That's the effect of depression and a lot of other mental health conditions. So really, then we need to figure out then how do we help those moms to become more responsive? Not just how do they take care of the physical needs of their babies and toddlers, but how to become emotionally kind of responsive. So the new theme in brain development within the last few years is this serve and response idea. You guys familiar with this? So if you're interested in any of this, there was a report put out about the effects of neglect on brain development by this group of neuroscientists at Harvard within the last several months. This is widely available. You can get it on websites and so forth. But the underlying idea is that babies and toddlers depend on this serve and response kind of interaction, the kind of interactive processes that this video was showing in order to develop at all. That's what so the baby does something, and then the parent hopefully reads the cue correctly, and then the parent responds appropriately. And so it's in hundreds and thousands of those kind of interactions that attachment is born. That's how attachment develops. That's how it's sustained and maintained. And thus that's the meaning of sort of babies needing a co-regulator, right? And so that's the kind of information, knowledge, and expertise that we want child welfare agencies to have and to incorporate in their systems, and for the larger community to help them with. And so one of the more interesting developments in child welfare in recent years, and then in some places in this country, there have been the development of baby courts, where of course experts in infant mental health development are brought into a judicial kind of setting with judges, and so where the information on child development is right there at the ready for the decision makers, with a very strong focus on infant mental health development there. If neglect goes on over a long period of time, then there is a really very impressive long list of effects here, and this is just the sort of the standard kind of list here. And I've already mentioned compromise the immune system. So for those of you who are interested in this subject, particularly I recommend the Bruce Perry book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and that has 8 or 9 chapters which are different stories about the varying effects of severe neglect and trauma in very, very early life. So I recommend the Bruce Perry book. I think it's a well-written, well-researched, enjoyable, engaging kind of stories about kids that are very, very helpful. The other person in this state who I just think the world of is Deborah Gray, and she's a therapist in Bellevue, and she's written books on adoption, and I think she has the most intimate, complete, thorough feel for the intimate world of neglected kids of anyone that I'm aware of, certainly anyone in Washington State that I'm aware of. And so the book I recommend, Deborah Gray's book, is Nurturing Adoptions, and I think this book has more, and it is just, by the way, just as good for foster parents and birth parents as it is good for adoptive parents. And it has more practical advice on what can people do, what can caregivers do to help kids to calm down. So what's the key issue for traumatized kids? How do you help them calm down? Because once they go off, so they're very sensitive sort of to signs or indicators of possible danger, and once they go off, they have trouble in calming. And so that is concretely what we want foster parents to be able to do for kids. We want them to help them to be able to, they have to have, that's a skill set. That's just not loving babies, that's a skill set, right? So the same for foster parents, the same for birth parents, right? This is the ACEs sort of thing, and I had mentioned this earlier. This is from these Kaiser Permanente studies, the HMO in San Diego, and this is sort of the pyramid that describes how early abuse and neglect and other adversities affects long-term health and mortality. And so at the top, if you can't read that, that top pyramid there says early death, and the next one under says disease, disability, and social problems, and so forth. So the underlying idea is that in order to cope, people gradually begin to do things that are very self-harming. So the underlying idea is that early adversity leads to behaviors that are self-harming. And so the finding of the ACEs studies was that adults into their 50s and 60s who had been abused and neglected in childhood and had lived with chemically dependent parents or with violence or with mental illness and so forth were more likely to die of all kinds of things, more likely to have diabetes, obesity, heart disease, several cancers, gastrointestinal problems, strokes, suicide attempts, sexually transmitted diseases. I mean, just a whole formidable range of ailments that were associated with early adversities there, right? So we really are talking about life and death stuff here. And that goes on over, I want to say this again, the consequences of early maltreatment, particularly if it's chronic and severe, last for a lifetime. So there used to be a time in Washington State, and Ken can probably remember this time, when we actually had very good therapeutic child care programs all over the state. And then through a bunch of horrible decisions at the policy realm that still make me mad when I think about it, this state very deliberately destroyed those programs in order to increase the rate of federal reimbursement, right? But if you talk about the type of programs that we actually need for kids, they are those child haven type of programs. That's the type of program for kids, because we're not going to go put all these kids in foster care. That's not going to happen. So there's got to be some kind of alternatives here. And so the best alternative we've discovered in this state is those therapeutic child care programs. And so we know they're doable. At one point they were affordable. And that's the kind of direction we need to go. We also need to go back and apply some simple lessons here. So easier to help people who are less troubled compared to when they're more troubled. So wow, so that just means more investments in prevention and early intervention, and concretely within the Child Welfare Agency, within the Children's Administration, it means that some of the policies that I have to admit, mea culpa, that I helped to develop about assessing risk at intake, and we're going to direct all the resources to the high-risk group, that's not sensible. If you're going to get a bigger payoff on your resources, you direct the resources to the low-risk group, or to the moderate risk group, not to the high-risk group. If you have to make a decision, you're going to have a heck of a lot of trouble in helping the high-risk group. You're going to have much greater rates of success with a low-risk group, right? So there just needs to be some rethinking here about how to prioritize the use of limited resources here. And I have mentioned the design change, and maybe I've just got a couple of minutes to talk about that, because it can't just be that we're going to be saying to caseworkers, we want you to become more knowledgeable and skilled and just invest more in these families and so forth, but we're going to have the same old kind of system that we got now. No, it can't be like that. So basically what we need is, particularly for the chronically neglecting group, we need it to be easy for caseworkers to get these families comprehensively assessed. And so in order to do that, agencies and the community have to join together. So we really do have to have effective, practical, on-the-ground collaborations between substance abuse, mental health, domestic violence, at the very least, DD with the cognitively impaired parents, and public health because of the child development part of it. So we need those people to join, and so that it's easy as a phone call. When one of these cases comes back with 20 or 30 referrals, and then, whatever we've done in the past that hasn't been effective, here they come again. We need a caseworker to be able to make a phone call to a facilitator to set up an assessment process without having them to call 6 agencies, and it just can't work like that. So there has to be a better sort of collaborative kind of deal here. I want to say that over the years, the best system that I have ever seen for actually treating and intervening with chronic neglect was in Portland, Oregon, and this was in the late 1990s, where they actually had 4- and 5-person family support teams that consisted of a substance abuse treatment specialist, a mental health specialist, a parent advocate, a child welfare caseworker, and one more person whom I can't remember right off the bat. These 4 or 5 people worked together in a child welfare office, and they held about 20 to 25 cases in common at any one time. They were funded out of family preservation dollars at that point in time. They had 8 or 9 of those kind of teams in Oregon at that point. Over the years, the legislature in Oregon, through budget crises, chipped away at that, and they eventually demolished it, right? That is still the single most effective intervention model that I've ever seen for chronic neglect. And while we may not be able to ever have 4 or 5 people who have 20, 25 cases, maybe we can have 4 or 5 people who have 40 cases, and who actually, so a different kind of way of assigning than saying every case is going to have an assigned worker. No, every case has an assigned team, and the team shares 25 to 30, 40 families, right? So in an ideal world, that's the kind of response that we would want to build. And so the question is, in the real world, not the ideal world, the real world we live in, to what extent can we accommodate or get closer to that kind of a model? And I've said that, and I think more I could say, but I think with that I'm just going to stop here, and we got about a couple of minutes, and so maybe we'll just leave a little time for questions or comments here.
So if that's all that you got today, it would be a bargain, right, for your time. But wait, there's more. There's more.